1,000 words. You can see, the number of, the percentage of Latino kids, girls and boys, at a younger age, and it's very young population, which of course, many in the fertile ages, so higher fertility rates, and very few at the top. Well, you can see the white population being essentially, that bulging baby boomer, which is starting to retire already, and is going to need a lot of wage earners to maintain it. Leave that there for a second. So there is much reason to worry. Recent studies suggest that corporations often find it more expedient to recruit abroad than grow their own workers, capitalizing, for example, on the demographic dividend that is resulting from this growth in Latin American migration, and as well as others. Moreover, when already educated in the United States, skilled and highly skilled immigrants from Latin Americans have exhibited persistently higher levels of unemployment and underemployment of any other group. Regardless of how long they have been in the United States, Latin American immigrants with comparable levels of education have lower earnings than their counterparts from other regions of the world. Dominant migration narratives are filled with omissions, as well as with dichotomous notions of deserving and undeserving immigrants that help reproduce these lopsided policies, skilled versus unskilled, and labor market segmentation based on gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, and legal status. So while the current immigration narrative has us drooling over IT workers from India or scientists from China, nothing wrong with that, it simultaneously underplays the need and presence of large numbers of service or production workers from Latin America. A significant number of these workers are unauthorized to work in the U.S. and are under mercy of black markets and scrupulous employers. The state in their home countries is usually absent in protecting these workers, and they arrive in situations in which they're also increasingly unprotected by the nation-state laws here. Latin American immigrants, along with the Latino native-born, have historically and certainly now inexorably ended up on the undeserving side of the deserving-undeserving dichotomy. Works such as Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America by May Negai, or the chapter titled Problem Mexicans, Elena Newton's recent book, are but two of the newest additions to the literature attesting to this historical trend. As such, immigration narratives and policies must be interrogated, not so much for what they tell us, but for what they don't. For starters, constructions of deserving immigrants lead to policies that support full membership rights in our societies. In concrete terms, that may mean a green card and pathway to citizenship. On the other hand, constructions of low-skilled and often undocumented Latin American immigrants as criminals, freeloaders, with little to offer beyond their cheap labor, have served to justify, at best, that policies that place severe limits on their social and political membership rights. And that is, for example, policies such as guest worker programs. You are allowed to work, but you're allowed to do very little. And the presentation this morning by Ernesto, illustrated some of that. At worst, these constructions of immigrants as undeserving have helped justify enforcement-only policies such as the rash of Arizona-style and deportation policies we have seen lately, and which are intended to fully deny these workers all rights to social and political membership. And Nebraska just discussed, just debated, I should say, LB 48, which was the Arizona-style law that was introduced by one of our new, it illustrious, a nice guy. But remind me to tell you the story at the end of how it all ended. My mother's goal for the rest of this talk then is to scrutinize further what I consider to be some of the most problematic omissions in dominant migration narratives in analysis of Latin American migration and integration. The title of my talk, From Casualties of Development to Political Actors, ? Offers some clues about two of such omissions. The first hints at our insufficient attention to the relationship between development policies and large numbers of low-wage immigrants in the United States who are settling in devalued labor markets and then also are settling among vulnerable middle and lower-income populations. Such is the case in many of the rural communities in which meatpacking and, of course, ongoing agricultural worker in many of our states in the region. So in a way, we're really talking about, when I say casualties of development, you may think I'm talking only about Latino workers, but I'm really talking about the fact, I'm trying to begin to shine the spotlight on the fact that they're casualties of development north and south, even though we only think of being the refuse of development of these immigrants crossing the border to our wealthy and very democratic nation. But the reality is a lot more complex than that. The second omission in our narratives results from the same biases producing the other lopsided narratives about immigrants being simply poor, unskilled workers. In this case, however, I'm referring to our failure to detect the multiple ways in which Latino immigrants contest and even subvert the forces of exclusion resulting from economic development and public policy. I.e., in this part, again, I'm trying to highlight the second part of my title that says political actors are Latinos as political actors. So in the limited time I have left, I don't know, I'm not so sure how my timing is doing here. I think we're good. Yeah? I don't know how long this will be, but I think we're good shot. And based on additional examples from the Nebraska case, I will first outline just a couple of ideas about how I think it is necessary to reconnect the discussions of development and migration. And next, I offer a few examples of how immigrants, and in this case Latino immigrants in Nebraska, are challenging their marginalization directly and indirectly, sometimes with their very presence, and in time have and can become formidable political actors. So this is an argument I'm still working on, so we'll see if it works. I'd love to hear other ideas. But particularly the first part, it's a very difficult thing to do, because you're trying to connect these, as Steve said, I'm interested in global political economy, so I'm trying to connect these ideas from very large systemic forces, all the way down to more local, per your conference theme, more local kinds of circumstances. So anytime you're doing that, you're bound to get lost along the way. So to that first point, how we need to reconnect development and migration. According to the IMF, Latin America has been the most unequal world region since at least 1985. Wealth concentration in the region grew in the aftermath of the debt crisis of the 1980s, when neoliberal globalization policies decimated remaining safety nets and deregulated the financial market. As market openings, privatization, and the disappearing of national industries, as well as public sector employment advanced, millions of people were displaced from their land and from their jobs. And if you follow the whole NAFTA discussion, you remember that was sort of the most salient paragon of that era, and what it did to displace people from their own regions and so forth. Advocates of neoliberal globalization contended that this economic development model would reduce inequality and in time would provide higher incomes for all. This was, in my own words, the globalized version of the American dream mythology, otherwise known in Latin America as the Washington Consensus because of the role that multilateral organizations and U.S. government entities based in D.C. played in formulating these neoliberal economic policies. The reality has, of course, been very different. And while the region has shown remarkable recovery since that faded, lost decade of the 1980s and then the neoliberal policies that follow up to the 1990s, a recovery that has taken 25 years, the combined consequences of all of this, including the neoliberal policies purported to act as a corrective to the debt crisis and to supposedly the inefficiency of state-led development models that preceded the current economic policies, became evident when governments found themselves increasingly unable to provide sufficient employment and livelihoods for large majorities of young workers who were joining in that other kind of bubble that the very large number of young people that were still connected to high fertility rates early on. The government has also been particularly unable to close the income gap between less than 5% of the population who control obscene amounts of wealth and more than a third of the population who remains under the poverty line. In addition, large numbers of middle-income earners face increased risks of joining the ranks of the poor and are also increasingly fleeing. This is where the majority of migrants from Latin America come from, not really from the poorest sector, but from the middle-income sectors. And these are people who are not only fleeing the consequence of these ravishing consequences of debt crisis and neoliberal policies, but every other social impact that echoed out of this, including increased corruption. You know, when the ship was sinking, then all those government officials and bankers that could see how they could recover their place in their economic standing, engage in increasing corruption, and then increasing violence and crime and so forth, as you have large numbers of unemployed or subemployed youth and young workers. As Joseph Stiglitz, the former chief economist of the World Bank in 2009 and 1, I believe, Nobel Prize winner said in a recent Vanity Fair article, quote, "The more divided a society becomes in terms of wealth, the more reluctant the wealthy become to spend money on let me rephrase that. The more divided a society becomes in terms of wealth, the more reluctant the wealthy become to spend money on common needs. The man that initially supported neoliberal globalization in Latin America and elsewhere, Joseph Stiglitz, now writes that, quote, "The rules of economic globalization are designed to benefit the rich. They encourage competition among countries for business, not for workers, which drives down taxes on corporations, weakens health and environmental protections, and undermines labor rights. These are exactly the kinds of conditions that are among the main roots and causes of migration. Coupled with demographic factors such as this booming population that cannot be accommodated into labor markets that have shrunk and so forth, and safety nets that are all but decimated, Latin America was bound to become a labor surplus region." But Stiglitz wasn't talking about Latin America when he wrote this last month, I believe. He was talking about the United States. And there's been a lot more, because I think the 2010 figures reveal the inequality gap in the United States. And this is where omissions in the migration narrative and its disconnect from the critique of development policies matter most. The U.S. has become an increasingly unequal society, And the 1% that controls nearly a quarter of the nation's income is increasingly reluctant to spend their wealth in public goods.